Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And Ginny, I think we're only going to have part of me today, just a fraction of me.
Oh boy.
I guess if you're in listener land and not watching this
You
on
didn't
video,
see.
that didn't but I went partially off camera while still trying to stay in relative proximity to the microphone so you could still hear me. So
Yeah, and I rolled my eyes. So there you go.
But no, I thought that there was a good conversation in the SpinSucks community talking about uh, going in as a fractional leader within an agent or within a client rather. And so I thought that's something that would be worthwhile discussing, particularly because it's something that you've done yourself in the not too distant past, and so can speak to your personal experience on it. And I've done similar things as well. So perhaps we can share some unique experiences along those lines.
Yeah, the gist of the conversation in the community was I've been working with a company and I use my team to help support the PR needs. Now the company is thinking about hiring an employee and would like me to direct that employee based on, or manage them essentially. And it was an interesting conversation for sure. Also, to your point, I do have that experience where I've, in many cases, have become either the marketing director or chief marketing officer or chief communications officer for a client and directing their teams, hiring, firing, all that kind of stuff. There are some things to consider, and we are not attorneys or accountants, but there are things to consider from that perspective, because if you are audited and you have somebody, a fractional person, leading your team and hiring and firing and making those types of decisions, and that's what they also do for their own business, you could get into some trouble from that perspective. But we've had really good luck with it. We have, right now, we probably have three of our clients that we serve in that capacity, where we're their marketing department. They don't have anybody internally that runs marketing or has any marketing experience, so we do it all for them. And depending on, it's just like I'm an employee, as their marketing executive person, and then based on what they need and what we agree on the goals, I bring in different team members throughout the year to help get the work done. That piece is interesting. And then also the piece of this, I actually just saw on LinkedIn, somebody said, whoever has decided to rebrand freelancer to fractional marketing director was brilliant. That's essentially what it is. But probably 2 years ago, it's been almost 2 years now, that I was there. I was the fractional chief communications officer for a company for several years, and my team didn't do any of the work. They had a team internally who did the work, and I managed and led and did reviews and onboarded and all of those kinds of things. I sat in executive team meetings. I mean, I was essentially a very, very part-time employee, is how they treated me. And I had to be paid differently because of that, because of the way that it works from an IRS perspective. But it works if you can figure that piece of it out and you're careful about how it's structured. It definitely works. And it's, what I was trying to do, and the reason that I did it is because I don't have any in-house experience. So I wanted to have that experience to be able, to round out my resume, but also to understand how people look at the work that we do internally versus having an agency do it, so that I could round out that experience from a professional development perspective too, to be able to coach people to say, if you're thinking about this, this is how it's handled with an agency, and this is how it's handled in-house.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of things to look at here. One is sort of the business side of it and how you function that way, and the second is, as you've touched on, the administrative side of it and how you handle some of those things. And so, I guess I'm inclined to focus a little bit on some of the painful, boring administrative stuff first, and then
Sure.
and then talk a little bit more about some of the substance. On the administrative side, as you note, you do have to be careful. Really, the client is the one who has to be careful
Yep.
about how they are setting up your compensation and working with you, because if you walk like an employee and you quack like an employee, you're probably an employee.
Yep.
And so from their perspective, they may want to protect themselves by paying you as an employee or something like that, as opposed to paying you as an agency or freelancer or consultant or whatever. Now, that said, I will tell you it is quite common for that not to happen. I
Yep.
know of any number of cases, including myself in the past, who have done those kinds of engagements where you basically walk and quack like an employee, but you are not. So your mileage may vary. Talk to a lawyer, talk to an accountant, encourage your client to do that, to just make sure that you're classed properly, because it is largely on them if there's a problem, not on you. That said, the area where I think you need to protect yourself if you are going into this and you are not an employee is to make sure that you have clear written authorization for whatever it is that you are doing. And so, some specific examples. In the event that you are signing contracts on behalf of that client, you should have written authority to execute either the specific contract or contracts generally and with specific guidelines. Because for two reasons. One is because if you're not an employee of the company, you probably can't legally bind them by signing a document. So if you're
Yep.
hiring a vendor and you sign it as a consultant and you don't have written authority to do it, or clear documented authority, if that contract may not hold up, which penalizes the vendor that's been hired. But it could also be one of those things where if you sign it, they can then, your client, if that relationship were to break down, they could come after you and say,
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't have signed this. You owe us the money
Yep.
you have to satisfy the requirements of this contract.
Yep.
So make sure, and that's true on the employee side too. I mean, I think you, as a consultant, you need to be really careful about hiring, particularly firing, but employee discipline, any of those kinds of things. What I generally have done in the last 10 or 15 years, whenever I've been in that kind of situation, is not to have on paper authority over any employees. And I would simply be a dotted line, but they would have someone else who is an employee who would be their on paper supervisor. And I would make sure that that individual communicated proper HR stuff to them,
Yep.
whether
Yep.
that's raises, promotions, etc. I can certainly be deeply involved in it, and they may
Yep.
even defer to my recommendation, but I treat it as a recommendation, frankly, to protect myself and secondarily to protect the client. So be careful about how you're setting these things up if you are not an employee, because you are functioning differently and you're potentially opening yourself up to problems down the road if something goes sideways.
Yeah, and I would also say one of the biggest challenges I had with one particular client is that the president was the one who hired me, and he and I worked out all the deal and had the paperwork and everything. And so, from my perspective, I was quote unquote reporting to him, and the CEO had a different perspective on things, but it was never communicated to me. And he expected me to build a team internally, hire, do the whole thing as an employee, and make those recommendations up the chain as an employee. And I wasn't doing that because A, it had never been communicated to me, and B, I wasn't an employee. So it came to a pretty big head where he was really angry with me. And I had to say to him, first of all you had to do was tell me. And secondly, I can't really function in that manner because I'm not an employee. I have a business, I have my own team, I have my own, like, all of this stuff. So if you're looking for an employee, I'm not the right fit. If you're looking for someone to help you mentor and coach a young team that's going to grow with your business, then I am the right fit. And he and I mean, for several months went head to head on that kind of stuff because he expected me to act like an employee, and I just wasn't going to do it because I wasn't an employee. He wanted me to fly to New York for meetings. He wanted me to be at all of their on site. They went from hybrid to fully in person, and he wanted me 3 days a week there. And I was like, I'm not an employee. So
Right.
it ended up, we ended up finishing the relationship because he and I just couldn't come to an agreement. So I would say, I relay that story to help you understand that if there's more than one decision maker, you have to ensure that all decision makers, all executives that have a hand in making the decision, are on board with whatever the contract is, whatever you've negotiated.
Well, and I think this is, you've underscored what is fundamentally one of the problems with being a fractional employee from whatever standpoint that is, whether you're doing it as an agency owner or you're doing it as a freelancer or that kind of thing. Fractional roles tend to work best when there's a fractional amount of work to be done.
Correct.
The problem is that when it comes to marketing communications, there's really no limit to the amount of things that you could do. And so it's not like being a fractional head of HR or IT or something like that, where at some point, in all likelihood, there just isn't any more work to do.
Yep.
And so you have a natural end of the week. When you're doing things like marketing and communications, you can always have more ideas and campaigns and initiatives and all that kind of stuff. So it is much harder to draw the line. And as much as you may put things in the scope of work to fence it off, either your expectations or the client's expectations may be for more to be done.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges I've had in these kinds of roles is sitting there and saying, I know I've promised only a day a week or whatever it is, but can I just leave them hanging? Like, yeah, I mean, if I've spent my 8 hours for that week, but then there's an important meeting coming up and I want to make sure that the perspective of the marketing team is being represented there.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I can say I'm not going to go to that, but I'm sort of cutting off my nose to spite my face. And so if I want it to continue to be successful, I kind of need to do some of those things. And so trying to figure out how to manage that is much harder than it seems going in. And most agency owners are really ambitious people who want to do a good job. And so drawing those lines becomes incredibly difficult. So I always counsel, if I've got a client who's looking at this kind of relationship, assume it is going to take way more time than you think. So if you think it's going to take a day a week, charge them for 2 days a week, because it's probably going to be closer to that by the time all is said and done.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's so much unknown too, because this isn't a professionally formulated position. It's fairly new. There's fractional chief marketing officers. To your point, there's fractional HR administrators, fractional IT. There are people that will come in with expertise that the business either can't afford for full time or only needs them for a certain amount of time. So you have all these roles that it's fairly new, and so there isn't sort of that structure around what it looks like. And you do have to think about, okay, if you're a fractional 1 day a week help freelancer, whatever you want to call it, solopreneur, employee, whatever you want to call it, and there's an important meeting on Wednesday, or there's an important offsite meeting, or that's going to last a week, or whatever it happens to be, and you can't really be like, well, I'm only being paid for 1 day. So there are lots of things to think about, and some of it comes with experience, some of it comes with listening to people like us who have been through it, some of it comes from asking questions in communities and forums. But I will say, though, that it is highly, I enjoy doing that. I enjoy having access to different types of people. In this case, I'm around my peers, so I'm around other people who are high level. It's not just me as the agency owner running my business with my employees, but I'm around other, senior level executives in a business. So I have access to a CFO, and I have access to other business leaders, and I have access to a chief marketing officer as a peer, and that's a different relationship. So for me, I enjoy it. It's highly satisfactory. I learn a lot. In the one client that we worked with for several years that we ended the relationship with, they had a chief marketing officer who's probably the smartest person I've ever worked with, ever, hands down. And I learned so much from him just being there day to day. But I was definitely not 1 day a week. It was like 30 hours a week easily. So you have to really think through that, and also be strong enough to say, you know what, we thought this was going to be 1 day a week, but it's ended up being 3 or 4. How can we renegotiate this contract?
I'm still just reeling from not being the smartest person.
Chief marketing officer. I said chief marketing officer.
All right. Okay. All right. Whew. Well, I feel better there. I mean, that was a close call then.
He was probably
I agree with you. I really enjoy those kinds of engagements. Whether it's for a traditional business or an agency or those kinds of things. I mean, to me, it's incredibly enriching. It's a learning experience, as you've pointed out. You get a different perspective on things. For me, in part, it's like, you get some of the best aspects of being an employee without all of the baggage that comes along with being a full-time employee for
Yep.
any organization.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so I think there's a lot of reasons why this can be appealing, as long as you can figure out how to fence it appropriately so that you're
Yep.
able to produce results that you're happy with and the client is happy with, and it doesn't damage the rest of your business. I think one of the ways to do that is to focus on doing these kinds of things on more of an interim basis as opposed
Mhm.
to completely open-ended. It doesn't mean
Yep.
that you have to have a date certain that it ends, but it should be for a transitional period, understanding that at some point they're probably going to need someone full-time, and setting that expectation both for yourself and for the client from the beginning so that you're taking it in that direction. And so that way you're giving yourself an easier off ramp when it starts to feel more like being an actual
Yeah.
employee and
Yeah.
all of the baggage that comes with that.
Yeah. I will say that, to your point earlier about marketing and communications being more open-ended, the way I've always structured it is like for a certain amount of time based on the need to transition or to hire. Um, Sometimes it's for a quarter, sometimes it's for 6 months, sometimes a little bit longer. But what I have found is that that timeline always gets pushed out further and further and further. And I've also found that when you're interviewing people for your role, they get a little skittish in the interview. They're like, well, wait a second, why are you leaving? And what and you explain that you're not an employee, all the things, and they still get really skittish. They're trying to understand, is there an ulterior motive here? Is there something going on that they're not telling me about? Are they not being honest? So there's that piece of it, even though you're very open and you're being honest, and it really is, I have my own business, but there's still that, like, but why? And I think part of it is because this is such a new way to approach working with organizations that not everybody's accustomed to it. So there's that piece of it too, when you're, and it's a weird position to be in, to, you know, create a role and mentor and coach and train a team, and then interview to find your replacement. It's a strange position to be in. But if you do it correctly, you will be in that strange position.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, if you handle it well with people you're interviewing, good candidates appreciate the fact that they will have someone who can help them with the transition.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
so I have often seen that outcome, where the prospective hires actually come to the point where they're like, but now you'll still be sticking around for a bit afterwards to help, make this successful, right? And so that's something that you, before you go hire your quote unquote replacement, you should be working out with your client to make sure that that is part of the roadmap. But I would encourage for it to be part of the roadmap, because it
Yeah,
it
I
can
agree.
make a big
Yep.
difference versus most of the time when you're hiring someone senior who's being just dropped in because whoever it was left to go somewhere
Left.
else, and there
Yep.
is no over. And so you now have an opportunity, and frankly you may be able to maintain some sort of consulting relationship that may still be beneficial for you and your agency going forward. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want it to work out that way. The last thing that I would say on this fractional idea is, make sure if you are positioning it as fractional, a fractional role, that that's really what it is. Because
Mhm.
what I see a lot of now is marketing agencies in particular saying, we'll be your fractional CMO. And they don't really mean it. They're looking at it
Right.
as a traditional agency
Yep.
relationship where we
Yep.
do very, very specific things. If you are
Yep.
positioning yourself as a fractional senior leader within that organization, they are expecting you. They are not expecting your team. So this is
That's
different.
right.
We always tell you
That is
your
right.
clients
Yep.
don't care who. Here they do, because you
Yep.
are positioning yourself that way. And secondly, if you're positioning yourself that way, you really are at that point simply selling your time. And I know that you don't feel like that's what you, but as an employee, you're not, your scope of work really has to be more in times context, as opposed to based off of, I'll do 3 press releases and I'll manage Google ads
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that kind of,
Mhm.
because ultimately if they're viewing you as a fractional employee, they want you to do employee like things, which
Yep.
means it's going to change from week to week. And so you
Yep.
need to be prepared for that, if that's how you're going to position it. If that's not what you want to do, then sell regular agency services. Don't call yourself a fractional CMO because you think it'll make it easier to sell.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there are pros and cons to it, just like anything else. And there are lots of lessons to learn for sure. But I think we can both say that it's been for both of us, it's been, really beneficial. I've learned a ton more than I would have just staying on my own.
Absolutely. And for me, particularly, because I've generally run small businesses of no more than, 15, 20 people, it's nice to be able to be part of a larger organization. And as you've mentioned, all that comes along with that, proper CFOs and HR teams and all of these kinds of things
Yep.
that, they're fun to have as part of your week. I don't necessarily enjoy them
Right.
when they're something
Right.
I have to deal with every day. And
Yes.
my apologies to all of my
Best of both
HR and
worlds.
CFO friends out there, because I have a lot of you.
Yes,
But
you do.
in any case, all right. Well, I think that we gave a full measure of advice on being a fractional employee.
Geez.
At least that's how I view it.
Okay.
So with that will draw to a conclusion this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Gini Dietrich.
And it depends.